All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're going to dismantle some of our deepest, most hardwired modern assumptions about age, biology, and history. We're tackling a question that honestly feels incredibly uncomfortable to our modern sensibilities. But when you peel back the layers, it reveals an absolutely fascinating story about human survival.
12. Think about that for a second. Today, a 12-year-old is in middle school, right? They're navigating early adolescence, maybe struggling through pre-algebra, and definitely arguing with us about screen time. By universal social consensus, they are 100% a child. But here's the wild part. For the vast majority of human history, across almost the entire span of our species' existence, 12 frequently marked the transition to parenthood. Today, obviously, that is rightfully criminalized, but historically, it was just the norm.
To understand why this jarring reality wasn't seen as monstrous, but rather a practical necessity, we're going to systematically break down the ancient world. We'll quickly look at the modern misconception, biology's unchanging clock, the life expectancy myth, the economic reality of childhood, the ancient support systems, and finally, why everything changed.
Section 1. The modern misconception, a clash of eras. So, the core issue here is that we constantly project our modern definitions of childhood onto ancient people. We totally ignore that their framework for development and social maturity was radically different from ours. I mean, today, being 12 means middle school, is this highly protected developmental period completely shielded from adult burdens. But anciently, it meant stepping directly into survival roles and reproduction. And this wasn't because ancient humans didn't love or care about their kids. It was simply because they were operating under completely different biological and environmental pressures.
Section 2. Biology's unchanging clock, the evolutionary schedule.
The fundamental premise we have to grasp here is that the human body literally does not know what year it is. It doesn't care about our modern labor laws, and it certainly doesn't care about our compulsory education requirements. The human reproductive system matures according to a biological schedule that's been calibrated by millions of years of evolution. In modern, well-nourished populations, female puberty typically begins somewhere between 8 and 13. Now, ancient populations did experience it slightly later, mostly due to lower average caloric intake and much higher physical demands. But, and this is a really critical point, that difference was measured in merely months, not years. The biological capacity for early reproduction, it's basically always existed.
Section 3. The life expectancy myth. Reframing the math. Okay, let's talk about the widely cited 35-year ancient life expectancy because it is a deeply misleading statistic. Adults didn't just suddenly drop dead in their mid-30s. When historians say the average life expectancy was 35, they are factoring in incredibly high infant and child mortality. The actual relevant metric we need to look at is life expectancy conditional on surviving to reproductive age. Basically, if you made it to 15, you actually had a very reasonable prospect of living well into your 50s or 60s.
But getting to 15 was the hard part. Up to 30 to 50% of children died before their 5th birthday. Let that sink in. And those mortality risks, famine, disease, violence, they didn't just magically vanish the second you became an adult. When death is that omnipresent, delaying reproduction becomes a massive, genuinely dangerous gamble. Think about the sheer risk involved here. A 15-year-old who chose to wait 10 years to have a child was literally gambling their entire genetic lineage. They were betting that they'd still be alive, that their partner would still be alive, and then environmental conditions would actually hold up. Under those high mortality conditions, early and frequent reproduction wasn't a moral failing. It was simply an arithmetic necessity for population replacement. Section 4. When childhood meant work, the economic reality.
You see, the whole concept of a protected childhood stretching from ages 6 to 18, that's basically an invention of the Industrial Revolution. It's really only about 200 years old. In ancient societies, the transition to adulthood was not some sudden leap. It was a gradual, relentless accumulation of vital household labor. By age 6 or 7, children were out gathering food and carrying water. By early adolescence, they were doing adult-level hunting, farming, and building. By the time they hit 13, they had already achieved full practical competence in core survival skills.
So while a modern 13-year-old is in this protected developmental bubble, an ancient 13-year-old already had about 7 solid years of adult-level work experience under their belt. Modern society waits for the prefrontal cortex to fully mature into the mid-20s, but ancient societies, they just couldn't afford to wait.
Plus, the adult roles they needed to fill on a daily basis didn't necessarily require the same complex, abstract cognitive profiles we rely on in today's information economy. And as human populations settled into agriculture, this dynamic took on a really sharp economic edge. Early marriage essentially became a calculated alliance to leverage labor and secure vital resources. Daughters, specifically, were often treated as economic assets to seal these alliances. Now, that is an uncomfortable historical truth for sure, but it's one that drove agricultural societies to incentivize younger and younger marriages. They needed to lock in those interfamily bonds and produce inheriting grandchildren as quickly as humanly possible.
Section 5. The Ancient Support System. It took a village. Now, you might be wondering, how on earth could a 13-year-old actually manage a baby? Well, because they were never setting up an isolated nuclear household the way a modern teenager would have to today. They had something absolutely incredible working in their favor, known as the grandmother hypothesis. Young parents were heavily embedded in robust, multi-generational networks. Grandmothers, aunts, mothers-in-law. They provided crucial food and childcare. They transmitted vital child-rearing knowledge. This highly evolved social infrastructure substantially mitigated the young parents' lack of emotional maturity, and it measurably improved infant survival rates. They were literally never doing this alone.
And this brings up a massive nuance in the historical record that we can't ignore. Early reproduction wasn't universally locked at age 12 everywhere. Hunter-gatherer societies like the Hadza or San, which, by the way, most closely approximate our ancestral baseline, actually saw average ages at first birth hovering around 19 or 20. It was the intensive agricultural societies that deliberately pushed those ages down into the early teens for all those economic and labor advantages we just talked about.
Furthermore, ancient societies were perfectly aware that biological puberty did not automatically equal social readiness. Many instituted specific initiation processes, sometimes lasting months or even years to bridge that gap. You might have the physical capacity, sure, but you still had to go through specific learning phases, service, or social ordeals before the community actually granted you the status of full social adulthood. Section 6. Why everything changed. The modern context.
So, if this system worked for them back then, why is it so incredibly unfathomable to us today? Well, the biggest driver of this change was modern medicine. As infant and child survival rates dramatically improved through the 19th and 20th centuries, that massive demographic pressure we discussed, it completely plummeted. Families realized they could start later, have fewer children, and still reliably produce surviving descendants.
The entire context shifted underneath our feet. In the ancient world, you had extended family networks, and children were literal labor assets. Today, we largely live in isolated nuclear families, and let's be honest, children are incredibly expensive. On top of that, modern economic participation requires decades of formal education, which is something that early parenthood completely disrupts.
So, the absolutely crucial point here is that early parenthood is genuinely harmful today because that ancient social scaffolding is completely gone. There is a severe lack of multi-generational support, there's an enormous economic cost, it interrupts compulsory education, and importantly, it places immense, isolated demands on a developing prefrontal cortex without the whole village there to buffer the stress. What was once a highly adaptive survival strategy in a deeply connected tribe is today a recipe for disaster in our modern education-dependent economy. It all boils down to this profound reality. The biology of reproduction has not changed in 300,000 years, but the world that biology operates in has changed beyond all recognition. History isn't just some simple story of ignorance being replaced by modern wisdom. It's a story of vastly different solutions being applied to vastly different problems in completely different environments.
Which leaves us with a pretty intense thought. If biology hasn't changed in 300,000 years, and it was merely the environment that shifted our culture, what happens if our environment shifts again? It really makes you wonder just how fragile our modern social constructs actually are, and what other biological realities we've merely paved over with culture. Definitely something to chew on.